Okay, folks, it is 11 o'clock. Good morning and welcome to the 2021 GSHA Virtual Business Meeting and Conference. We hope you enjoy our presentations over the next 2 days. Please be sure that you are muted and your video is off. And questions will be taken at the end of the presentation through the chat box only. So we'll not be having any audio during the question and answer session. So please, as the presentation goes on, you may feel free to type your questions in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, I will go through and find and read all those questions for Jose, and he will answer them for you. It is my pleasure and honor to present Mr. Jose Antonio Esquivel. Mr. Esquivel's presentation will be about the Mestisaje, 17th century New Mexicans with Spanish and Indian ancestry. All right, so Mr. Esquivel, if you're ready, we are ready for you to start.
Wonderful, great, thank you all. Thank you for being here today. I very much appreciate the invitation from GSHA to present. My name is Jose Antonio Esquivel. It's been a while since I've presented at some conferences, and appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. And I want to say thank you to each of you for being here. I certainly see names of people I've worked with in the past that are here. So sorry I can't really see you at this point, and we're not there in person to greet each other. And then I see names that I see on Facebook here as well. So hello, folks. And one of the things, at least at this point, you get to hear my voice, not just see my typed words and my one standing photo that's on Facebook. I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen because I'm assuming that a few other folks are on their way in. But let's get my presentation up for you all, and let's get started. Let me see if I can put this into presentation mode. There we go. Let's get that to the first slide. And now I can see you all over here as well. And I'm going to change that view so you're not all blocking my way here. Can you all see that? Linda, Phyllis, can you see that, Phyllis?
Yes, wonderful. I certainly can.
Great. Well, folks, let's have some fun with genealogy. I've been doing this work now. It started way back in 1985. Researching, of course, my own family roots to understand that. For those of you that aren't aware, my father's family line, of course, is from New Mexico, deep roots in New Mexico. My mother is from Laredo, Texas, and she has roots in South Texas, but also northeastern Mexico, and began to do this research after my daughter was born in 1984. But as I learned about how to do genealogy, I learned about the sources, I began to document my ancestry and genealogy. I decided a couple things. First was that I wasn't just going to follow the paternal line. I know a lot of people just stick to maybe one line, one or two lines. I wasn't interested in that. I really wanted to see everything. And part of that was because my parents had a wedding book that at the end of the wedding book, they had this family tree. They had these names of my parents' parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents. I think there was only one name missing on that last line. But I remember as a child being able to read these names of these individuals. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I became interested in wanting to know a little bit more about these people. Who were they? And began to do the research to understand how do I then trace my own family. But that led me to something more. That led me to more than just wanting to collect names. I wanted to know the history. I wanted to know what happened during the time frame these people lived in these different areas. What was going on in history? So I began to read history. I had a father-in-law who gave me a book by Paul Horgan, the Two Rivers, the book, and began to understand the history of both South Texas, northeastern Mexico, and then New Mexico, and just developed this love of history. But then as I did more and more research into the family history, and I'm sure many of you discovered this as well, that as I went further back in time, I began to realize that the people that I was documenting as my ancestors were the ancestors of so many other people. And this is where, for those of you who have reached far enough back, you begin to see and say, wait a minute, I'm related to you. You're related to me. We're both related. And sure enough, as you continue to go back and back and back, what you find in our work, for those of us with roots in New Mexico, is that we go back to a core group of common ancestors. And there's a reason for that. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this particular presentation today. And so I began then to think, well, then if I'm learning about this history and other people's ancestors of my ancestors, why should we duplicate the research over and over again? Why do we need to research the same line 100 times? Why not share the information that I have? And that might help other people who connect. And maybe they don't have to go through all of that detailed history and genealogy. And that's when I began to write. I began writing in 1989, and I first published my Esquivel series on the genealogy of the Esquivel family in 1992 in the New Mexico Genealogist. And not long after that, became acquainted with GSHA. And I was an honorary founding member of GSHA when it was first formed. I had contact with people here in Denver. And as folks were putting together their journals, I began to submit articles. So some of my very first articles were submitted to the GSHA journal many, many years ago. But that has been my motivation to sharing information. And I know that many of you have probably seen some of my published works. Many of you maybe haven't, but you've probably seen my research because it's shown up online without any citation. There are a lot of family lines that I've been able to trace back, and people have taken that information and put it online in Ancestry and all these other places. So you might be surprised, those of you that haven't been involved in New Mexico genealogy for many years, to learn which of these family lines were actually uncovered by the research that I've done over the many years. But it's quite a few, it's quite a bit. But thank you, those of you who have followed my work over the years, thank you for that interest in that. It's been quite a ride these 30 some years, and really a great privilege that I've met so many interesting people, been able to work with historians, Mark Simmons, John Kessel, Rick Hendricks, Rob Martinez, the current state historian, Esteban Rael, who's presenting, the former state historian, Stan Hordes, another former state historian, and through my connections with my friend Albert Gallegos, Albert and I used to do research together in the archives in Santa Fe. And through Albert, you know, he's been so gracious to introduce me to so many other people, to a couple of ambassadors. And it's really through Albert that my work was recognized, and I was granted a knighthood as a Caballero de la Orden de Isabel Católica back in 2009. But that's because of Albert recognizing the work that I've been doing to uncover Spanish history in New Mexico. So thank you, Albert, for that recognition. Now, one of the things that I've always had an interest in over the years as I've done the research is documenting certain pieces of information, because certainly we owe a lot of credit to Fray Angelico Chavez. And I hope everyone here knows this, that even if you're new to this work, pick up a book of Origins of New Mexico Families. It's still critical. Now, it's getting outdated, but it's still the linchpin for our work. And certainly I have really spent a lot of my time building off of that work to go beyond origins, to go further, to trace the lines even further. But one of the things that I've done in my collection is I'm always interested not just in collecting the names of my ancestors, but finding information on other families as well in these records from the 17th century is my specialty, because I'm able to read those documents. But I collect as much information as I can about how people were described, what their relationships were with each other, cultural material items, what were their occupations. You know, I want to know information about places, churches, the houses, you know, acequias, anything I can find, I want to document and put together. And one of the things I was able to do, and I'm going to encourage you right now, if you get to Santa Fe, and please travel safely given the COVID epidemic, but they have an exhibit now on the Palace of the Governors. But I was able, through looking at many, many records, to compile a bit of an understanding of all the different rooms of the palace in the 1660s. So please, if you have a chance, get to that exhibit. I feel really honored that some of my research helped to inform that. But one of the things I was collecting, and it was surprising to me that I didn't see in Chavez's book, is I know that Chavez saw these references to our ancestors as being mestizos. I know he saw those because I've gone back and looked at his sources and it's right there. But Chavez chose not to include that in his book. And we're going to come back to that at the end of the session. And what I want to be able to do with this, and I'm hoping that you all in your work have seen some of this. You've either seen some of my research or you've seen this as you've done the research, these references to these caste designations, because the Spaniards were really hung up here on wanting to identify people by caste, because that set people up in the social strata, the social hierarchy of what they were eligible to do in their society and what privileges they could gain based on their caste. And of course, preference being given to people who were Spaniards from Spain. Secondly, on the latter were the people who were immediate descendants of Spaniards on both sides of their family. And then came the mestizos, the people who are part Spanish, part Indian, and then it goes on to all these different mixtures. But I think I really, over the course of the 1900s, there was this big emphasis on New Mexicans being Spanish. And I was even told that I was Spanish American. Maybe some of you received that as well. Somos españoles, we're Spanish. But I think we have to rethink this. And I have made an effort in my writings to make sure that I include caste designations. And I'm going to encourage you that as you do your research to include caste designations, because they tell us something about these people. They tell us something about their ancestry, and they tell us something about social interaction and cultural history. And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've been able to gather over almost 30 some years of research, pulling things out of fragments of information. And I always, when I did my first writing on the Esquivel family, I included the Indian lines. I included the mestizo lines. These are folks who left descendants as well. So let's have a little bit of fun. And what I'm going to invite you to do is that if you happen to see an ancestor here, type it into the chat box. Tell us that you're a descendant of this family, and maybe you'll find, who else are the cousins here that also share these people in your family. If you've gone back this far, if you've not gone back this far to the 17th century, eventually you're going to get there, and you're going to find some of these names are going to be pretty common in your ancestry as well. So let's have a little bit of fun here, folks, and then please ask the question. So if there's something I go through pretty quickly, or you have a question, keep in mind that what I'm sharing with you here is based on documentation. And so you may have seen something different online. So don't always trust what's online if it doesn't have a source. So if you see some information, the genealogy charts that I have here, and go, wait a minute, that's not the way it is on Ancestry, ask the question, and I'll tell you that this is based on documentation, not just on somebody's whim of genealogical fiction. And believe me, there's a lot of genealogical fiction online. All right. So I'm going to start with this quote from this priest, Fray Esteban de Perea. And in 1631, he had just gone through this process of announcing an edict of faith. He called all the people to come forward to denounce people who might not be, living their lives according to the Catholic customs or behaving in ways that wasn't acceptable to the Catholic faith. And people would come forward and denounce their neighbors, etc. And the interesting thing about this edict of faith is that Perea puts this report together. He has numerous people give testimony denouncing their neighbors for things they've done. Most of what was denounced, though, and you would have thought that if there were crypto Jews in New Mexico, somebody would have said, oh, my neighbor's a crypto Jew, because I can tell you that in New Mexico in 1631, not everyone got along. There were plenty of enemies in this small group of community of Spanish folks. But the observation that Perea had after he had collected all this information, and people had shared stories about herbs and potions and aphrodisiacs, or trying to make people fall in love with each other, or trying to keep a husband faithful. Here's his observation of the people in New Mexico, and keep in mind Perea is a Portuguese guy, he's from Portugal. The people of this new land are raised here with the custom of Indians, without schooling, since they are many mestizos, mulattoes, and others. That was his observation. Now, this has been quoted in some history books if you read New Mexican history. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's prove it. Let's see, is this the case? Was this true? Was he just someone who was a Portuguese guy who was biased against the people in the New World? And that did exist. Or were there really mestizos, mulattoes, and others in New Mexico? So that's what we're going to run you through here. How accurate was Esteban Perea, or was he just being a biggest? So you should just, for a frame of reference, know that in 1598 to 1609, and particularly in the 1598-1601 period, there were about 240 soldiers, some with families, that came to New Mexico with Don Juan de Oñate. And this is where people get misunderstood, because I know you see this long list of people that came to New Mexico, and people think that maybe all these people stayed. They didn't stay. Many folks got disenchanted up here. They couldn't find the silver, they couldn't find the gold, they couldn't find whatever. They invested, what were anywhere from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, some of them, and they got nothing in return, and they left. So that by 1609, many of these folks, in fact, the people who remained were only about 50 soldiers, and they were ready to leave. They were ready to give up if they didn't get support from the crown. But it was finally in 1609 that the royal crown said, we're going to keep New Mexico, mainly because the Franciscan friars had made their case that they had baptized, a couple 10,000 Indians, and they didn't want to leave these Christian Indians undefended or alone, or not to continue to proselytize with them. And so it was decided that New Mexico would be retained, and that these 50 remaining individuals were there to help to protect the Franciscan friars and to help those Franciscan friars with evangelization. And of course, we know that in those days, people were pretty much in a community near San Juan de los Caballeros until they came to Santa Fe. So 50 people. I want you to think about a room of 50 people. In fact, I don't even know that we have 50 people here. Do we? How many people are here with us? Phyllis, can you see the count? 36. We have 36 people here. So imagine we have 15 more people. And that was the Spanish population of New Mexico. And many of them had families and kids. So you can maybe double it to 100, 150, less than 200 people. And I think probably the conference, Phyllis, you probably have more than 200 people at the conference. And that was the Spanish community of New Mexico. You got to think that these people knew each other. You got to think that people knew something about each other because it was such a small group. So let's get this in perspective, folks. These numbers that we see in the old documents, about 50 soldier vecinos, tax-paying citizens in 1609. There's a 48 accounted for in 1617. There's 50 accounted for in 1620. And then again, 50 accounted for in 1626. But then there's about these 250 other individuals, 100, about 1,000 mestizos. This is important because this was a time, a period where there was a lot of building going on. The churches at the pueblos were being built. There was a lot of construction going on. So I'm sure they brought people up from the south, but maybe not people who would have stayed in New Mexico this whole time. And so then in 1638, we have 50 soldiers that have remained in New Mexico, about 200 individuals. Again, folks, it was not a large population. And again, people had to know each other in this community pretty well in terms of their background. All right, so given that, let's go through this piece right here. Let's take a look at what we're going to look at first. So the first thing here is I want to get you a sense of some of these women. Now, some of you may have read some information about these people being Native American, but I want to just kind of walk you through this just to see the context and just see how prevalent this was at this time period. And so these are some of the ancestral mothers that were Indians, and we'll go through these real briefly. And I would imagine that you're already recognizing some of these names that are here, but let me walk you through some of the evidence that we have in regards to these women, and then we're going to go on beyond these ones. The presentation goes to others as well. So Maria de Zamora. Now this was an interesting person because we know the names of her parents, Pedro de Zamora and Agustina de Abarca, and we have the names of her parents, and they're both Spanish names. And so for many years, I think Chavez, myself, and others, we thought that she was of Spanish background, and we were trying to track down her ancestry through the Zamora and Abarca family. Now, curiously, there is an Inquisition denouncement. She was denounced to the Inquisition in 1607 for being an hechicera, they call it, for doing potions, etc. But in that process, we learned some things about her family and her family background. So we learned that she's from the Barrio de San Sebastián in Mexico City. I'll talk about that more in a minute. She told people that she had moved from Mexico City to Oaxaca at age 7, but then later on her family moved back to the Mexico City area where she married Bartolome Montoya in Texcoco, which was a mixed community of Spanish, Indians, and mestizos, but he was a native of Spain. And then she came with Bartolome and some of their children in 1600 to New Mexico. Now, looking at this map here, don't worry about all the details here. This is an old map from the 1550s of Mexico City. Take a look at the indication for north. This should be on your left. If you don't see it, it's there. North is on the left. And you'll see that I've highlighted San Sebastián. San Sebastián is a neighborhood or a barrio that was developed out of the Tenochtitlan neighborhood of also Cualco. And so this is where she was from. And there's a good chance, I would think, that her family, as we learned that she was an indigenous person, may have had roots in this part of Mexico City before the Spaniards came, or maybe even immediately after. Her family may have resided here. And the indications are that her father and mother became Hispanicized Indians, Mexican Indians who received some sort of social privilege, and therefore they became Hispanicized enough to have these Spanish surnames. And the fact that her father was an alcalde of Oaxaca, if you look at those records, there's no indication of the Spanish side of Oaxaca that he was an alcalde. There's a chance that he was the Indian alcalde of Oaxaca, not the Spanish alcalde. But this might be the place where we might find some of her roots if we did more research into this part. It's really now the northeast corner of the downtown area of Mexico City. So we know that Maria de Zamora, she came with her children, some of them close to adulthood in 1600, and that she was accused of being this bewitcher for using herbs and potions, which may again be another clue to the fact that she had some Native American background and had some Native American, maybe she was a curandera type of person who was using herbs to heal people, but people thought that perhaps she was trying to influence people in a hard way, in a bad way, and to harm them in some way. But how do we know that she's an Indian? So these are some clues here. But how we know that she's an Indian is the fact that two of her grandchildren were given the caste designation of castiza and castizo. Catalina Zamora and Juan Lucero de Godoy were both children of Pedro Lucero de Godoy and Petronila de Zamora. And we know that Pedro was of Spanish background. I found his baptismal record in Mexico City and was able to then distinguish that he was from a Spanish family. And therefore, if these two kids were castizos, which means they were 3/4 Spanish, 1/4 Indian, that means that Petronila had to be a mestiza. So she had to be half and half. And we know that her father was from Spain. Therefore, in order for Petronila to be a mestiza, her mother had to be an Indian. And so this is the evidence that we have that points to Maria de Zamora being an Indian. Here's another one, Pascuala Bernal. There are very few records related to Pascuala Bernal. And we know that she was the wife of Juan Griego. We know that he's a native of Greece. We know that they came to New Mexico in 1598. We don't know her place of birth. We don't know who her parents were. We don't know much about her background other than her name. But what we do know is that one of her daughters, Maria Bernal, was identified as a mestiza. And we also know that the one son of hers was identified as a mestizo, and that it was said his father was a foreigner. And so again, it's from this evidence here that we figure out, well, to be a mestiza, you have to be part Espanol and part Indian. And so from this, we get this evidence then that Pascuala Bernal was of Indian background, most likely from Mexico City, but we don't know. But anyone that's descendant of the Griegos has a combination of both European and Indian ancestry. And her grandson, Diego Gonzalez Bernal, was identified as castizo. And that matches up because his mother would have been a mestiza. We know that his father, Sebastián González, was from Portugal. So therefore, he was 3/4 Spanish, 1/4 Indian, castizo. And that's how we know that in that regard. So we have another Indian ancestress here through Pascuala Bernal. And we also do know that Juan Griego himself could speak Indian languages and was said to be he could speak the Nahuatl language. So that's the other thing that gives us a clue that she may have been from Mexico City, may have been a Mexican Indian. And so these are some of the individuals that you may be descended of. I know I'm descended of Sebastián González and Isabel Bernal. I know that people have Juan Griego in their lineage. I believe I have that one as well. I know I'm descendant of Diego Moraga and Juana Bernal, and very likely also from Juan Duran and Catalina Bernal as well. So these are common ancestors. If they're in your ancestry, let us know. I want to know that. Here's another one. Now, this is a person who is specifically identified as an India Mexicana Ladina. And in this case, the Ladina refers to the fact that she could speak Spanish very well. She was very fluent in the Spanish language. We know that she was a native of New Spain, most likely again from the Valley of Mexico. She was the wife of a Catalan, a soldier who came with Oñate, Juan de la Cruz, said to be Espanol and a Catalan. But she was also described as India Ladina muy españolada, which really means that people regarded her as very Spanish. So although she may have looked Indian, she was very acculturated into the Spanish society. So good chances are that she came from a higher rank of society among the Indians of Mexico City. Chances are that her parents had been somewhat Hispanicized as well. So she may already have a couple generations of individuals in her family that spoke Spanish and were acculturated as Mexican Indians into the Spanish culture. She herself had 2 Indian servants, so it's not uncommon for an Indian to have Indian servants. So again, that tells me that she came from a bit of a higher class of Mexican Indians in the Valley of Mexico. And she was accused of using potions and herbs in beverages and foods to enchant people. And hard to say how much of this, there's a lot of testimony about this. My bet is that she did dabble in this herbal magic to influence people, to enchant people. Good chance she did. And there's a good chance it came from her Indian side of the family. But the Spanish folks were pretty, they were susceptible to these things as well. Because if a woman was being mistreated by her husband, she wanted that husband to treat her better. She might be given a potion or something to put in that husband's food to make him more like her better, or to not abuse her, or not to fall in love with somebody else. If a woman suspected her husband was having an affair, there would be potions and food mixtures of herbs you could put in that person's food to make them less desirable to your husband, or to make your husband not want to go out and see other women. But these are the kind of things that she was accused of. And of course, there were a couple of individuals who died, and it was said that because they died because they ingested these potions and these kind of mixtures of herbs, and it caused their death. But nothing came of it. They weren't brought to trial, although a lot of testimony was taken. But again, this tells us about this influence of Indian background into the Spanish culture. And her daughter was described as mestiza, and was also accused of having caused some deaths and illnesses themselves. And we know that Juan Griego and Juana de la Cruz are both progenitors of the Griego family. So if you're Griegos, you have plenty, really good dose of Mexican Indian ancestry in you as well. Maria de Villafuerte, this is one of my ancestors. She too was specifically identified as India Lalina Españolada. But what's interesting about this one is that we actually know where she came from. The Pueblo Catilan is just north of Mexico City. She was born there in 1586. Those of you who might be familiar with the devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, you might remember that Juan Diego, the Indian who the Blessed Mother appeared to, was from the Pueblo de Catilan. And so, it makes me wonder just to what degree that Maria de Villafuerte, had some interest in this, because we know that one of her sons, Cristobal de Anaya, had a painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe in his possession in the 1660s. And I have an article coming out on that in a new book that I'll tell you a little bit about a little bit later, that'll be published here at the end of October. Well, we know that she was the wife of a Spaniard, a man named Francisco Lopez Paredes. He came from Jerez de los Caballeros. And that she had at least one daughter, which I would think any of you that have Anayas in your family are descendant of this woman as well. This is Juana Lopez de Villafuerte, who is specifically identified as a mestiza, born in 1608 and married to Francisco de Anaya Almazan. So here we at least know, and I have looked at these early records of Guatemala, but I can't find any information on the Villafuerte. So I'm not sure, if her father was a Villafuerte, or whether she adopted this name later through baptism, whether her families were Indians named Villafuerte. Any of you who have an interest in this, there are some books that provide names of Indians from this time period. I just haven't had the time to really dig into those to see if we can find, was there a particular group of Mexica Indians that took the Villafuerte name? And could we trace this back to an Indian who was associated with a Villafuerte who came with Cortez? More research can be done here in terms of her background and just how it is that she acquired her name. And again, because she was muy Ladina or Ladina Españolada, she was considered to be Hispanic. In fact, Perea even made, it was Benavides, Alonso de Benavides, the prior, he had even indicated that these women were treated as if they were Spanish women. And that's how acculturated they were. And so again, I suspect that she probably came from a higher social class of the Mexican Indian population in the Valley of Mexico. Now, let's turn this a little bit to a different ancestry of Indian, and this is Doña Inés. And I'm hoping, folks, I'm so pleased that she's getting more recognition. I wrote about her first. I believe I was the first one to put this into print in the old magazine that Ana Pacheco would publish, La Herencia del Norte, when I published something on the Martín Serrano, to give attention to the fact that this woman named Doña Inés, a Tano Indian, was the mother of a man named Hernan Martín Serrano. And what's interesting about Doña Inés, and I'm glad she's getting attention here, is because she was taken from New Mexico during the Castaño de Sosa expedition in the late 1680s, early 1690s. She was taken away and went down to Mexico City. So she was removed from her family home as a child and taken down south. And whether that was by agreement of her parents or not, we don't know, but certainly that would have been a traumatic event for her. But that means that then she was raised among the Spanish folks in Mexico City. And when Don Juan de Oñate came to New Mexico, he brought Doña Inés with him. Now, she's only mentioned once in the records, maybe twice, but she was coming back with him sort of to play that role like La Malinche that Cortez had, someone who could maybe interpret, who understood the Indian ways in New Mexico and could serve as a bridge of cultures between the Pueblo Indians and the Spanish. The thing is that when they got to New Mexico and they got to Galisteo, where she was from, the Pueblo, none of her relatives were there. Nobody knew who she was, and she couldn't speak the language. So she wasn't much of a use in that respect. We don't know much more about her until the 1620s and 1630s, where we hear a little bit more about her. She felt more comfortable living among the Spanish folks than she did among the Pueblo Indians, and became a resident of the Villa de Santa Fe. And it's curious that she carried this designation of Doña Inés, no surname, just Doña Inés. She was well respected in that regard. And we do know from the records that she had a son, Hernan. There's no indication that she was married to the original Hernan Martín Serrano that came in 1598. We don't know that. He had another wife, but we don't even know that his wife, Juana Rodriguez, even came to New Mexico. So we don't know what that relationship was in terms of her giving birth to this boy. But we have several records that identifies Doña Inés as the mother of Hernan Martín Serrano, who lived in Santa Fe. And she also had a husband. He was an Indio Mexicano. He was a Mexican Indian. He was a blacksmith, Francisco Barón, living in Santa Fe as well. So that was the stepfather of Hernan Martín Serrano, was an Indio Mexicano. And then this particular branch of the family, this guy had 2 wives. We don't have the names of their children, but very good possibility that Juan Martín Serrano is part of that family, and that some of the DNA is showing the connection to this group as well in regards to this Hernando Martín. And it is from this family that there is a branch of the Sena family in Santa Fe that actually is descendant of this, because there was an ancestor of the Martins that was known as Bernardo de Sena Martin, which was named after the saint Bernardo Siena. But what happened is that they dropped the Martin name, kept Sena, and that confuses them with the other Senas in New Mexico. All right, so then keep in mind that the Martin Serrano, there's a whole nother branch, because Hernan had a brother, Luis, and many of us are descendants of Luis. I know I'm descendant of Luis many times. This is the largest clan from Luis. This is the largest clan in New Mexico, are the descendants of Luis Martín Serrano. And we know that they were brothers. There's a record that describes them as brothers, and there's a record that describes Luis Martín as mestizo. We don't know who his mother was. We don't know if his mother was Doña Inés. We don't know if his mother was another Indian, but we know that his father then, because he was a brother of Hernan Martín, had to be this Hernan Martín who came in 1598. But we have plenty. We have the description of Luis as being slender, swarthy complexion, black hair, a beard, a mole on his left cheek, sort of that description of what you might think of someone who's mestizo. But look at this, boy, this guy, 23 children by 2 wives. This is what makes this clan one of the largest clans in New Mexico. Just about everybody has a Martín Serrano in their family somewhere. And then you'll see that their son was also described as mestizo, which tells us that his mother, Antonia de Miranda, was probably also a mestiza in order for him to be a mestizo. So her roots are not clear just yet in that regard, but let's do more research and see if we can't find out more about her background as well. All right, and then here is the mother of mothers, Maria de la Cruz. I did an article or helped with an exhibit on this one about the founding mothers of New Mexico. And she is definitely someone to be credited as a founding mother of New Mexico, Maria de la Cruz. There are very few references to her. We don't have any information on her caste specifically or her place of origin. We know that she was the wife of Juan Keres de Bustillo, and that she came to New Mexico with her husband with 7 daughters and 2 sons, and all of them are presumed to be her children. That's what we know at this point. And here's this list of these women that we believe in are indeed her children. We still need to find records, whether they're baptismal records or not, to fully confirm that she's their mother, but the DNA is pointing towards this as well. And so what you find in the records are these relationships. We have records that say that Ana Pérez de Bustillo was the sister of Beatriz Pérez de Bustillo, was the sister of Catalina Pérez de Bustillo. And then we have records that Beatriz and Yumar were sisters. And then we have these records that this asterisk, that Simón Pérez de Bustillo and Ana Pérez de Bustillo were brother and sister. Now, why this is important is because I've only found one record that names Maria de la Cruz as the mother, and it's a record for Simón. Simón was specifically identified as a son of Juan Pérez de Bustillo and Maria de la Cruz. And therefore, the conclusion is that his other sisters were also from the same realm there too, from the same mother as well. And then this last one, Diego de la Cruz. Now, folks, look at their husbands. Do you have Archuleta in your family? These are the progenitors of Archuleta. So yes, you have Indian ancestry. Hinojos, do you have Hinojos in your family? Guess what? You're descendants of Maria de la Cruz, most likely. How about Alonso Varela? He had a brother, but many of us descend from Alonso and Catalina as well. And then this Baca did not leave children that we're aware of because it was his brother Alonso that left descendants. And then you all may find that Simon might be in your ancestry potentially. And then I'm not sure so much about Diego La Cruz. I'm not sure that I've been able to trace many of his ancestors there. So here's the first part of this concluding, and we'll move into part two here, folks. Here's what this tells us. Indian women were founders of Spanish New Mexico. Now that sends chills through my body when I think about this, that Indian women were founders of Spanish New Mexico. I know that we spend a lot of time thinking somos españoles, and we're working hard to trace our lines. Everyone wants to know, does it trace to Spain? Can I get this line to Spain? We're all working hard to trace these families to Spain. And that's a noble thing to do. We still need to continue to do that. But let's not forget the fact that Spanish New Mexico was co-founded by Indian women. And that says something about the culture. That says something about the way that people were raised. It says something about the cultural influences that these women brought to New Mexico as they raised their own children, in their ability to, how they spoke and in the customs that they brought with them, how they interacted with other Indians, etc. So keep that one in mind. We have these Indian women who are founders. Now, let's move into some other families that we have identification from that are somewhat partially Indian, maybe mixed others. Many of you will find Alvaro Garcia Jurado in your lineage. I have him in my lineage through the Leyva family. And we find him designated pretty consistently as a mulato, meaning that he was part African and part Indian, not part Spanish and part African, but part African and part Indian. We know that he was born around 1581 and 1591, and that his wife, Juana de los Reyes, was also a mulata. She's described as mulata, but she had a sister named Juana Sanchez, who was a mulata, but this sister was identified, or at least Juana de los Reyes was identified as a sister of Yumad Keres de Bustillo. So somehow these two women are related to the Keres de Bustillo family and are mulattoes. So what's not clear to me is whether these could be children of Maria de la Cruz by another husband, or could these be children of Juan Perez de Castillo by another woman or by an African slave? We don't know. But this tells us that these two women were somehow related to the Perez de Castillo family. In that regard, folks, we should regard them too as founding mothers of New Mexico, along with their other sisters as well. Lujan. Now, I want to let you know, folks, that this Lujan ancestry is fragmented. It's very hard to find the documentations to actually link people with the surname Lujan living in the late 1600s to these early Lujans. There's just too many fragments. But I do want to share with you, I did a presentation a few years ago on this based on some research that was done with some other people on the Lujan project, which at some point I'll get published and put online or make it accessible to people. But nonetheless, even though we can't quite scare out the genealogy to trace ourselves confidently to these people, you should know that these individuals were consistently identified as mestizo, which means that Juan Lujan, who we believe is the progenitor from the Canary Islands, although we have no records to confirm the names of his children, clearly he must have been married to or had relationships with New Mexico Indian women in order to produce these possible offspring. Juan Lujan, Maria Lujan, Francisco Lujan, all born in the early 1600s, and two of them identified as mestizo. Now, we do know then that Maria Lujan married a man named Juan Ramos. They had a daughter. That daughter married her uncle in 1608. Both of them described as mestizo or mestiza. We know Francisco also had another wife, but we don't know who their children were. And they may have had children, but we don't know. A possible daughter is Maria Lujan. And the ironic thing is that most likely the Lujan surname descends through her and her husband Juan Luis, because some of their children were also described as mestizos as well. So let's go into that. First of all, this one guy, Juan Lujan, marries a Gomez Robledo. We don't know her name, but being a mestizo didn't hold him back from being a Cale Mayor of La Cañada up in the north. And we do know that then he had these children. Juan Lujan, we don't know who his kids were, but again, if you're an Archuleta, you will descend from this one because this couple here are the progenitors of the Archuleta family in the 1600s and 1700s. So you do trace back at least to Juan Lujan pretty confidently as a mestizo. And then there's this other Lujan family, Domingo Lujan, who I suspect is probably part of the Juan Luis Maria Lujan family, but we need to do a little more research on that still. Hopefully you saw my article on this titled Coyota about Juan Dominguez. But this line, we know there are lots of descendants of this Lujan family, especially in the Santa Fe area. And many people could trace themselves back to Domingo Lujan. What's interesting here is that we know that Domingo had a brother at Cochiti Pueblo named El Coita. So we know he had some relationship with Pueblo Indians. Chances are his mother was a Pueblo Indian, so we might have roots in Cochiti. We know that Juana Dominguez was a Coyota from Taos, and so that she has Indian ancestry in Taos. We just don't know who her father was. But if you look at these lines, I bet you're going to see some familiar names here. Jose de Quintana and Antonia Lujan Dominguez. I'm a descendant of this family, and I imagine many of you are as well. And then the Lujan surname was passed on through Juan Lujan, their son. But if you take a look, if you are Gurale, anybody Gurale out there? If you're Gurale, you descend from this family. If you're from this Aragon branch of the family, you descend from this family. And if you're from this Montoya family, then you descend from these Indians as well. Holguin. Now, for many years, we thought that Juan Lopez Holguin had this son Cristobal, but from his Spanish wife. But what we discovered, and what I was able to uncover through some research, is that Cristobal was actually a natural son. He was a mestizo. We just don't know who his mother was. And his wife, Melchora de Carvajal, was a Coyota, which means she was at least, 3/4 Indian, 1/4 Spanish. So sort of opposite of castizo. So we know that she had more Indian than Spanish in her. But all the Holguins would descend from this family then in the 1600s and early 1700s. And if you have Holguin, chances are you trace back to some one of their children. And again, this is a family of Indian and Spanish ancestry. Same thing with Trujillo. I know that for many years, we were all following Chavez's lead in regards to Diego de Trujillo being the progenitor, the man from Mexico City, born around 1612, who came to New Mexico by the late 1620, 1632 or so. And we all thought that for sure he was the founder of the Trujillo family. And Chavez thought that it was all through Diego's son, Francisco. But I was able to find some records, Inquisition records for Juan Trujillo, who was married to Elvira Jimenez and then Ana de Herrera, and his son Baltazar Trujillo. And Juan gave a good account of his family background. And he described his father as mestizo. We know that he was a native of New Mexico. His mother, Maria de Sandoval Manzanares, was a Coyota, also from New Mexico. And that he described himself several times as mestizo, and his wife was mestiza. And then Baltasar Trujillo, because he's the child of two mestizos, also described himself as mestizo. So it turns out that any of you who have Trujillo, and I have Trujillo, I descend from this family as well through Baltasar. Our lineage goes back to a family of Spanish and Indian ancestry both. And their children are pretty well described in the records, either as mestizos, and then of course, his children, Juan's children by his second wife are castizos, which makes sense because they are 3/4 Spanish, 1/4 Indian. Pacheco. And if you have Pacheco in your family, if you're descendant of Roca de Madrid, you have Pachecos in your family, and you have both Spanish and Indian ancestry. This one's curious because Chavez definitely saw this record. I know he saw this record because this is the source that he used to identify Jerónimo Pacheco as the husband of Francisca Javimo. But Chavez left out the fact that he was a mestizo listed in the record and that she was a mestiza listed in the record. And so if you have any Pachecos in your family, and the most famous line runs through Roca de Madrid as an interpreter of Keres Indians. And he had some Indian on his father's side as well. But Pachecos have a combination of Spanish and Indian ancestry. Now the Gutierrez, I have Gutierrez in my family, many of you may as well. Fragmented genealogy, not a lot of accounts for them in the records in the 1700s. I would imagine potentially Alonso and Ana Cadimo are the ancestors of Roque Gutierrez, who has many ancestors in New Mexico, descendants in New Mexico, but more research needs to be done, whether there's a true connection here or not. But what's curious about this record is that Alonso Gutierrez was identified as the brother-in-law, the cuñado, or he identified Isabel Quagga as his sister-in-law, cuñada, and that she was a Tewa Indian. So this again tells us that his wife was somehow related to a Tewa Indian, and that this family had relatives across the Pueblo and Spanish community, both the Tewa and whatnot. So chances are the Indian ancestry in this one is probably Pueblo Indian, most likely Tewa. Now here's an interesting family that if you are from Taos area, or you have roots in the Taos area and you're a Romero from Taos, you do not come from the other Romero family that came in 1598, chances are you descend from Alonso Calimo, also known as Alonso Romero, and his wife, Maria de Tapia. And she had two husbands, but her first husband, known as Hola or Jajola, was definitely a mestizo. And they had these children who are consistently identified as Coyote, which tells me that Maria de Tapia was probably could have actually been an Indian, potentially, in order for these kids to be regarded as Coyotes and Coyotes. But this family owned land in the Taos area. If you're descended from Juan de Villalpando, then you've got Indian roots as well. But this family has lots of land records for Taos in the 1700s. Maria de Tapia has children by her second husband. It's a very big clan. I think most people with roots in Taos, you're likely to find your descendant of this family as well. All right, I bet you didn't know, and maybe you did. Garcia de Noriega family, many of you have those roots, especially if you have Rio Bajo roots. You're a descendant of Alonso Garcia, Teresa Varela, and Alonso was identified as mestizo. He came from Zacatecas, he was a native of Zacatecas, and therefore then his children were at least, if Teresa was full Spanish, they were at least castizos. If she was mestiza, they would too be mestizos. But you might recognize these names in your ancestry if you are descendant of Alonso or Juan, or even if you are Rael de Aguilar, if you're a Rael descendant, then you have Indian roots in your ancestry as well. And then we're getting close to ending here. The Dominguez de Mendoza family. We have this one branch of Dominguez that are mestizos. We don't know who the father was in this case. We do know that Jose Dominguez de Mendoza was a mestizo and that we have the name of his mother is Ana Velasquez, an Indian. She was a cook in the Palace of the Governors. We know that his sister was Juana Dominguez, and we know that she was a Taos, she had roots in Taos. That's that Lujan Dominguez family. But her half-brother too was mestizo, and he had two wives, and those two wives then married, had children. One married the Giron family, so if you have Giron or Dimas ancestry, you're from this branch over there. And then the other woman married Antonio Martin Serrano. These ones are in my ancestry. This family descendants actually ended up in Mora, but I descend from Antonio Martin and Ana Maria on my dad's side. And then this woman here, hopefully you've seen this as well, written up in some journals too, but there's always been this question about the origin of Josefa de Hinojos. I think she was connected at one time to the Hurtado family, but she's not. She was the wife of Diego Montoya. Now remember, the Montoyas were part Mexican Indian and part Spanish. And now here is a different mix because we have this really remarkable testimony from 1775 in which Juan Candelaria, he says he remembers or he knew Josefa de Hinojos, who was the mother of Antonio Montoya, and he knows that it was said that this woman, Josefa de Hinojos, was married to Diego de Montoya or Diego Montoya, and he described her as a Coyota descended from the Pueblo of Zuni, and that she had an Indian brother named Ventura. So this is where we get this Indian Zuni Indian woman in our ancestry that you find online. It really comes from here. And where we get from this one is we know that Josefa and Ventura, and if you read the journals of Vargas, you'll find Ventura was a war captain of the Zuni Indians, so that she was somehow related. And we believe then that the common parent for both of them was a Zuni Indian parent, a Zuni Indian woman. And I believe the DNA that people trace back this way is showing Native American as well. And so this particular Montoya family comes back after the restoration of New Mexico to the Spanish folks, and that many of you that have Montoyas will descend from one of these individuals here. If you're Durani Chavez, chances are you descend from Juan Montoya. If you're Gallegos, chances are you descend from this branch as well. If you're Luna, you descend from this family, as well as a couple of those of you maybe from these other Montoya branches. So plenty of Indian ancestry there. Now, during this difficult time period of the Pueblo Indian uprising in 1680, a number of factors that resulted in that were not just, a lot of it was stress from famine, raids by nomadic Indians, as well as people feeling grievances about the way they were treated, how the Indians were not allowed to practice the religious practices, led to this revolt. But the thing about the revolt, it wasn't simply a thing of us versus them. It wasn't Spanish versus Indians, Indians versus Spanish. because there was a whole segment of a population that was related to each other. There were groups of people who lived in Spanish communities that had aunts and uncles and cousins in Pueblo communities. There were people in Pueblo communities that had aunts and uncles and grandparents in Spanish communities. They crossed the lines. They didn't just live separate from each other. Try and get that part out of your mind about the separate Spanish and Indian. These folks interacted and had relatives with each other. And these are just a few examples of people. Pedro Marquez and his brother Alonso Catati at Cochiti. And Alonso was the leader of the revolt at Cochiti as well. But we have this record that Pedro's wife, Lucia, was part Tewa, and that she had a brother at Nambe. So, you know, he had relatives, in-laws, and their kids were related to people at Nambe. We have this woman, Jeronima Marquez, that had an Indian aunt. Her aunt, Augustine Saiz, who left descendants in New Mexico, had an Indian brother named Juan Gagnan. Miguel Lujan was the brother-in-law of an Indian named Lorenzo Semito, so somehow there was a relationship there. There was a woman named Inés de Gracia. She was the sister-in-law of an Indian named Francisco Mutro, Tahique. And then this one's very curious because Francisco Lucero de Godoy comes from that family, but it was said that he spoke his mother tongue. So this draws into question about who his mother was. Was his mother a Towa Indian, that he spoke his mother tongue? And then Domingo de Herrera, up from the Santa Cruz area today, understood Tewa and Tano languages. So you can see how integrated some of these families were into each other's culture, Spanish Indian culture, language, and relationships. And so I'll lead you in with a couple of things here. So during this time period of Vargas coming back into New Mexico, he really relied on some of the soldiers that had relatives in order to negotiate some agreements and accords about how the Spanish government then could be restored in northern New Mexico. And so we know from these journals of the Vargas that Sergeant Juan Ruiz de Cáceres, when they came up, they found people that had been kidnapped or captured during the revolt. And so in that process, people were finding relatives. So this one's insightful here that Juan Ruiz, he found some cousins of his and a sister. Again, tells you that they were somehow related, and he was taking them from the north and taking them down to El Paso in 1692. And then the second one, although the Indian governor Domingo spoke Spanish, I read a letter to him through the Tewa interpreter Juan Ruiz. So somehow Juan had learned the Tewa language. So tells me he interacted very closely with Tewa people, possibly Tewa relatives, since he had cousins that were Tewa as well. And then this one's really intriguing and insightful to me. Miguel Lujan was described as the uncle of the wife of Luis Tuputu. And if you know your history of the uprising, Luis Tuputu was one of the leaders of the Pueblo Indian uprising, but he was also one of the main leaders that negotiated peace with Vargas. But think about this, that Miguel Lujan was an uncle to the wife of one of the leaders of the Pueblo Indian uprising. You know, what does that say? And I can only imagine that when Vargas came back, that perhaps this woman was saying, look, you know, you guys need to get things together. I have relatives I haven't seen in 13 years. You know, you guys got to figure out something to work out your differences so I can see my relatives. You know, I can only imagine what role she may have had in helping influence Luis to negotiate some accords with the Vargas. But Miguel Lujan was the uncle of my comadre, his wife, and would take him to see his sister in El Paso. So again, that close relationship among these people. Another soldier who was the uncle of Luis's wife would go fetch her sister, whom they had taken away last year. So apparently her sister, Luis's wife's sister, had gone to El Paso, not sure who that person was. And now, again, Miguel was being used as the person to help reconnect family members with this leader former leader of the Pueblo Revolt. And a couple last slides, and then we'll go to the questions. We've got these interesting developments in DNA. If you've been having your DNA tested, I've had both my paternal and maternal DNA tested. Paternal DNA is Western European, but my maternal DNA is Native American, haplogroup C. And so through the DNA, even though we don't have a record that these women were Indian, we're finding that they have Native American genetic history through their DNA. And so you may be descendants of any one of these women that you're seeing here. I won't read you their names, but you can see here that through the DNA project, they're being identified by their haplogroup or their origins. And thank you to Miguel Torres and the New Mexico Genealogical Society Data Project providing some of this information, but more and more we're trying to do the combination of genetic testing with genetic genealogy to trace these lines back and to make some determination. Now, these Indian roots could be further back in time. They might have parents that were regarded as Spanish, but it could be that you have a great-great-great-great-grandmother that was Native American, not necessarily that they themselves were Native American. And then also from Miguel Torres is this chart here showing that at this point we have about 85 to 90% of the maternal DNA of Mexicans that are testing is Native American. So very few of our maternal lines are from European origin, the majority are Native American. And quite frankly, I think what I just presented to you in the charts helps to confirm this, that we have so many women who are among the founders of Spanish New Mexico that have Indian roots. Now, what I'm not going to talk about, but it is something for the 18th centuries, we have this whole nother introduction of Indian influences from Genízaros. These are rescates, they're ransomed Indians, often ransomed because they were themselves captive and traded across different Indian groups. Spanish families ransomed them, but in order to pay back that ransom, these Indians were required to provide service in these homes. But as adults, they were released and then allowed to marry and form their own families. They were often some of them were raised in public communities in Pueblo culture, some in Spanish communities, and therefore they adopted Spanish cultural customs, language, and surnames. And to this day, many of these individuals descended from these Genízaros will tell you that they're Hispanic, they are Spanish, because that's the culture they developed. They will not identify, and they did not identify with a particular Indian tribe or group. But we've not done a good enough job of categorizing the genealogies of Genízaros. We really need these projects, and I'm pleased to see online, on Facebook and other places, this interest in Genízaros and this interest in their cultural influences in New Mexico. But I think one of the next steps we have to work towards is the Genízaro genealogies, because these people founded families with names like Baca, Roiba, Lucero. These are families that have these surnames. They may not trace back to the Spanish roots of these things, but they themselves are founders of New Mexico families. And so there's more work we need to do for this time period to document these genealogies and to acknowledge their influences as well as influence in New Mexico. If you want to read more, I don't know that the Tupa2 article is available online, but I did write this article a while back as part of a lecture I did to the Caballeros de Vargas during one of the fiesta events that we had many years ago. But it talks a little about this relationship between the Spanish families and the families that have both Spanish and Indian roots at this time. And then more recently, this one is online, Coyota Juana Dominguez, A Woman Between Two Cultures. You can search that online and find that article if you've not already read it. And it goes again into this understanding the dynamics between both Spanish and Indian cultures and this kind of thing. And a while back, I know there were some conflicts and still things going on in Santa Fe around this conflict between, how folks of Native American background have grievances in regards to how they've been treated over the centuries, and then this conflict with the Spanish cultures. And really, I know that Esteban, Rael, and others are working to look at ways to bridge things, but we have a history of bridging cultures. We have that in New Mexico. We were not us versus them in New Mexico. It wasn't Spanish. And yeah, there were times when people mistreated each other, but quite frankly, the Spanish people mistreated the Spanish people. Indian people mistreated the Indian people. It happened among cultures, but there are lots of examples of how people got along. And this commentary, which I believe is still available online from last year, you might find some interest in that as well. So I want to say thank you. I think we're on time, Phyllis. I want to say thank you, folks, for bearing with me on presenting this robust picture, I hope, of these Indian and Spanish ancestry in our genealogy. Reminding you to visit the Beyond Origins and New Mexico Families website. I am doing my best to keep some new updates on there, but at least it has all the old updates in there that you can find on all the different families. Always refer to Chavez's book, Origins of New Mexico Families, but then go to this website for any new information and corrected information, because there's a lot of misinformation online. So I'm going to stop there. I've done plenty of talking, and now I want to hear your questions and your comments. So Phyllis, I'm going to stop sharing. Is that okay? Unless
Yes.
I need to go back.
No,
For some reason I need to go back, I'll do that, but I'm going to stop sharing so I can pull up the comments as well. Oh, no, I can pull them up right here. But
I was just going to read them to you, or
okay. Yeah, go ahead and read them to me.
okay. So from Linda Senacoba, She says, I love this picture of the OK Owinge Pueblo. Thank you. And Jose, as you know, I am a descendant of Hernan Martin Serrano and possibly Doña Inez. Also, will Jose be providing his PowerPoint documents? I love them. I've had a couple people ask if they could have your PowerPoint.
It all depends how you guys are handling this, Phyllis, in terms of will you be making this video available for people or not? So
yes, the video will be available on YouTube. So I don't know if that's in lieu of sending.
I think that might work the best, only because Linda, what I'll say is that because I didn't cite the sources here, I'm confident because it's all drawn from sources. But my preference would be to work up an article on this that actually cites the sources for people so that you aren't just saying this is what it is. But if the video is going to be available, you might find it worthwhile just to come back to the video, and then you can do a stop, pause, and copy the information you want from the video versus disseminating this PDF without sources that are in it. But I'm confident because I did draw all the information from documented sources, but I would prefer that you do that if that works for you.
Okay. That works.
Thanks. Great. Thanks,
Linda Serna says, how accurate are the casta designations? I have seen different children in the same family identified as Espanol or Castiva at their baptisms.
Yep.
And to the above question, I've also seen mestizo along with Espanol for different children in the same family.
Absolutely. And it gets worse in the 1700s because I think in some cases people were eyeballing, the priests were eyeballing it. They may not have actually known what the parents' background was, and they were looking at skin color. So yes, I would say in the 1700s, you're going to want to look for more than one record potentially, but I would still record it because it says something that potentially, as we do our genealogy, because I remember researching a family that I'm descendant of from up in the Cañada area, Santa Cruz area, Gregorio Lopez and his wife Juana Romero de Medina, and I was having so much trouble trying to find where, this Lopez, it's like, I can't figure out how they got there. There aren't very many Lopez's that came back in 1592, 93. And then I finally found a record that he was a mestizo. And I'm going, okay, so I'm probably not going to find much if he had Indian background. So I think it's important to know, this in terms of potentially, if we do verify an Indian line, we're going to be pretty much at an Adobe brick wall where we're not likely to find their ancestry. Now, with the records from the 1600s, I'm a little more confident, but again, you're right, Linda, there'll be some inconsistencies there because some of these people I mentioned were mestizo, castizo, mulato, etc. But I think it's still important to document this because it does mean that somewhere they had some mixed ancestry. We want to continue to do the research to verify the caste of the parents as well. And you can see that I did that in a few of these records where people were castizo, but I was confident that the parents were Spanish and mestizo, therefore, whatever, and more than one record. So I'd say if you can find more than one record, great. But, we just have to keep doing the genealogy to see if we can verify that caste designation. But yes, just have an eye open that it could be inaccurate as well. And I do think it was based on skin color. I think that if people saw a child and they were more brown color, they would probably get that designation of mestizo. If they were more Caucasian looking, they would be Espanol or castizo.
From Linda Senacoba, I love when I see this info, as this helped me with my brothers doing their Y-DNA, that this is my familia. If you are a Sena and you are related to me, then we are descendants of possibly Juan Martin Serrano, and son of Hernan Martin Serrano II.
Yes, and certainly DNA can help us here. This is where having a few missing links, the more people from those lines that can do the testing, if we can get a good sample of them, we can gain some confidence of a relationship. So yes, more DNA testing will help us get some of these missing links confirmed.
Okay. Linda Serna, if my husband's DNA came back Q haplogroup, does that mean that he has Indio ancestry, and how far back would I need to go to find it?
That's curious because if you did the Y DNA, it should only be one haplogroup. The second DNA would be the maternal. That would be a second haplogroup. So it's possible to have two haplogroups, but one paternal, one maternal. I'm not aware that you would have two haplogroups in only the paternal line or only in the maternal line. Now the thing is good question. It's like, how far back does that Indian go? And I can tell you, like on my example, on my mother's line, it's Native American, but I trace back, the furthest I trace back, these people are still identified as Spanish. So I don't know whether that Indian root is like way back thousands of years, but I don't know where it starts. So yeah, you ask an intriguing question there, because the documentation may not show that any of the immediate ancestors in the last 200, 300, 400 years are Indian. So it could be that Indian ancestry is even further back. Now, the other question is, there's a good chance we're not going to know the tribe. And I know people have an interest in that. It's like, so what's the tribe? Unless you have a record that says they were Tewa, or Tano or something, you're not likely to know the tribe. Or more recently, we do have families in the 1800s who know that their great grandmother or so was a Navajo or was some other Plains Indian. You're fortunate there. But then you may also find yourself at a dead end, because you might not be able to trace her family anyway, because she may have been brought in as a rescue or as a servant and was displaced from her own family.
Okay, Lenny Trujillo says, Asensio Archuleta is my ancestor. Oh.
Great, fantastic. And, we know that he was a Basque, so we know that he was Spanish. And therefore, he married a woman who was mestizo and brought the Indian line into the Archuleta through his wife.
Very cool. Hector says, from a couple of Chicano studies courses, I learned that what we call ourselves is determined by the political climate of those times. Latino American in the 40s, Chicano in the 60s, etc. Could it be that folks in the 17th and 18th century were pretty much doing the same? By de-emphasizing their indigenous side, they emphasized their Spanish side because that is where the power was concentrated.
Yeah, and quite frankly, it was really hard, though, to de-emphasize it because they were such a class-conscious society, and because privilege was related to your caste. Yes, I think the goal was to get back to being Espanol. So you can see families that, if you had a mestiza, and you were not from a high social family, but even if you were from a high social family, you would want your mestizo daughter to marry an Espanol so that your grandchildren were more Espanol. And then you would want those grandchildren to marry Espanol so that at some point you could actually get your family back to being Espanol. Even though you had Spanish roots, by caste status, you could work your way back to being considered Espanol by having that marriage that way. So yes, indeed, that was the case. Now, what's curious in the frontier, things a bit different. If you go back to that statement that Perea had made, is that his bias is somewhat in there, but he was somewhat accurate as well. That there were mestizos here in New Mexico. But yes, I think on the frontier, you were less likely to be discriminated against because they needed people up here. They needed you here. So you can see that many of these individuals, because they were mestizos, they were also encomenderos. They were the ones in power. The Pedro Lucero and his family, his son was the secretary to the governor for several governors. So being a castizo or having Indian blood did not hold him back. The Montoyas the same way, being part Indian did not hold them back. The Anayas were encomenderos. It didn't hold them back. So I think in New Mexico, it's easier for these people of mixed ancestry to be in positions of political power and commercial success because the population was so small and they needed these people here, and they weren't competing against pure Spanish people.
Okay, interesting. Hector also asked Dr. Esquivel, during the life event of baptism, do you suspect that racial and ethnic classifications were determined on the baby's appearance alone, physical features such as hair color, skin color, etc., or was the priest aware of the baby's general family history, or did the priest consult with the parents to determine the classification, or all of the above?
No, I would, and someone answered this before. In the 1600s, there, like you saw, 50 families in the 1600s. My sense is these priests knew who these people were. They had some sense of their background. 1700s, thousands of people living in New Mexico. I don't think it's possible unless the priests were really somehow related or really close to a family. They may not have known their background, and the Indian ancestry would have been further back. So I would say yes, that most likely it was probably by the 1700s. It's probably skin color, eye, just by an eye look, unless someone really, really knew these people in their community to have an Indian relative, Indian ancestor. So yes.
Okay. Again from Hector, thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. It appears that indigenous, mestizo, and European people were all cooperating, socializing, and working together. It reminds me somewhat of the convivencia that occurred in Spain among the Christians, Jews, and Muslims.
Mhm. Thank you so much for that comment and for that word. It's a word that I like very much. How you get along. And I do think that in the history of New Mexico, there are many more examples of these cultures, the Pueblo Indians and the Spanish folks getting along, than there are examples of conflict. And yes, we have this one really tragic, traumatic event with the Pueblo Indian uprising. But quite frankly, when you look at this, and you can read my article on Juana Dominguez, is that there were other complicating factors that tore at the fabric. My sense is that in 17th century New Mexico, just like in any culture, there was a political faction of Pueblo Indians that saw some advantage to have a relationship with the Spanish folks. There was also a segment that probably didn't care one way or the other, didn't matter to them. They went along with their leaders. And then there was a segment that resisted. And so, I think there was those at least those three segments in Pueblo Indian culture. But it was the Indian leaders who were in favor of a relationship with the Spanish folks that maintained their political control and power and brought their people with them. And so I do think there was much more examples of that cooperation. Now, by the 1660s, 1670s, things are starting to change. We're running out of food, the famine, the drought. There's not enough storage of food, it's getting depleted. This is creating social stress on people, both the Spanish and the Indians. They're having to take food from one pueblo and transport it to another pueblo. That creates grievances, trying to get people fed and keep them alive. In fact, the Spanish folks thought that they were going to lose New Mexico to the Apaches because the Apaches were running out of food. They were raiding the pueblos. And so you have this fabric of cooperation that starts to get torn and worn away because of these other circumstances related to climate change, okay, where people are going and trying to struggle for survival. On top of that, up in northern New Mexico, there were a couple of Spanish folks that were really going after the Indians for practicing their religious practices. And I can see then where in the political structure, I could imagine that the leaders who were saying we need to cooperate were losing political control, that the people were getting upset and angry. And that's where the folks who were dissenters to the Spanish presence were able to get political control, organized the Pueblo Indian uprising, and were very successful at it. They pulled it off really well. But you can see that many years later, Popeye is out of power. Luis Tupatu is still there, and he has a different sense of leadership to once again come back to say we need to cooperate because we're being attacked by other Indians. We're not getting along. There's going to be some advantages to come back. And sure enough, those of you who are from New Mexico, and if you've lived close to the Pueblos, you know that there's been this relationship for many, many years between the Spanish communities and the Pueblo Indians for many, many years. And I think you would still find today some of the Pueblo Indian leaders that value that kind of cooperation. And so, yes, I like that word very much. And my hope is that even with the difficult conversations that are occurring in Santa Fe about the Santa Fe Fiesta, that people can get to that point of thinking more about that, how it is that we've gotten along together over the years versus the conflict.
Great. Priscilla says, can you tell me anything about the Alonso Varela's two sons that took the surname Jaramillo Negrete and Jaramillo
Yeah, a little bit. So we'll tell you a little bit about this. There are very few records on these guys early on, and it's actually Varela Jaramillo, and we get one branch of the Jaramillo family, and then it's Varela de Losada, not Negrete. The Jaramillo Negrete, they came in the 1690s, so they came later. That's another Jaramillo family settled in Santa Cruz. This other Varela Jaramillo that became Jaramillo settled in the Rio Bajo in the Albuquerque area. And then that branch comes from one of the brothers that came from northern Spain. And then the other, that was Alonso, is the root of the Varela Jaramillo family. Pedro Varela, his brother, is the root of the Varela de Losada family. We don't have any information on their wives. We don't have a clear indication. We have relationships, but there's not a record that says who their sons were, but we can discern that and reach conclusions about who their sons were based on people saying, this is my cousin, this is my uncle, etc. That's about all we know. And there is very little. And there's a reason why we know very little about these folks. And the reason we know very little is because those 50 families that I was talking about in those first years of 1609 to 1638, they were divided politically. there was a faction of those families that supported the Franciscan authority in New Mexico as the ultimate authority of governance in New Mexico. There was another group of those 50 that supported the governors, that saw that royal authority, governor authority, was the ultimate governance authority in New Mexico. And these two groups fought each other fiercely. There were the supporters of the Franciscans and the supporters of the governor. And they did not, I mean, some of them intermarried for alliances purposes, but these folks fought each other. I mean, there were battles with each other. They burned each other's homes. I mean, this is how much 50 folks. Imagine I'm in a room with 50 and half of us don't get along with the other half, you know? And so this is why you have one group of families settling in what's the Albuquerque area today between Sandia and Isleta. And that's where the Varela family settled. Then you have these other families settling in Santa Fe, close to the governor. Guess what? What's down in Isleta and in Sandia? That's the power base of the Franciscans. And so in this conflict, and we lost so many records with the Pueblo Indian Revolt, the only records we really have left are these Inquisition records and a few others. But the Inquisition records are a record of conflict. They're not about religion at all. They're about politics. People are denouncing people because the Franciscans are using the Inquisition as a hammer against their enemies. You know, what better way than to get at your enemies than to denounce them to the Inquisition? And that's exactly what they were doing. And that's exactly what led to the arrest of people like Francisco Gomez Robledo, Cristobal Anaya, Diego Romero. All of them were supporters of the governors, and even the arrest of the governor himself. It's these people here. So that said, we find more about the families of Romero, Robledo, Romero, and Griego because they were denounced to the Inquisition. And so we get more about their family relationships because people had to say something about those families. Or if they went to trial, they had to describe their families. So we have more information about these families that supported the governors. We have very little information about the families that supported the Franciscans. And this is what the Varelas were. The Varelas were factional people that supported the Franciscans, and therefore we don't find a lot of records. If things had survived the Pueblo Indian Revolt, we might have more records for them.
Okay. From what Manuel Romero, he says, my name is Manuel Romero, author of Me America, The Evolution of an American Family. I use some of your research for my book, so thank you for doing such great work. My question is, you seem to differentiate between coyote and mestizo. What is the difference?
Yeah, coyote is a curious term in New Mexico that's used. And I have to tell you that there isn't a consistent definition for this. On the one hand, if you look at the caste systems, coyote is defined as 3/4 Indian, 1/4 Spanish. So coyotes had more Indian in them. But on the other hand, I can tell you that I've often seen coyotes being described as mestizos that had Pueblo Indian parents to distinguish them from mestizos of Indians of other sorts. And so, as you saw in my presentation, there was a few folks named coyotes of Zuni, coyotes of Taos. You don't see coyotes of Navajo, coyotes of the Apache. You don't see that. You often see coyotes referred to as from the Pueblo places. So in some respects, I do think that coyote may have been a code. I can't prove this, but I want to think that potentially coyote was a code term for the child of a priest and an Indian woman in the Pueblo. We know that Franciscans were founding fathers in their own, they were fathers in another way. They were having children with Indian women. There's records of that. And one day I do have an article I'm working on this just to give a sense of who these priests were. Some of these priests were in New Mexico for 20, 30 years. And there are records that says these priests were giving dowries to their daughters. And so I'm sometimes wondering if a coyote or coyota was someone who was a daughter of a priest and an Indian woman. But more research needs to be done. So it's not too consistent. Definitely at least half Indian from Pueblo, but potentially 3/4 Indian from anywhere.
Interesting. Okay, Rebecca Hunter. Rebecca says, how did the native/Indian men or women who were marrying the Spanish get the Spanish name?
Yeah, isn't that curious? That I wish I had a better answer for that. I really do. Hard to say whether, I think we can see this pattern better among Genízaros in the 1700s, where these people like the Abeta family raised quite a few Indian children and adopted Indian children. And there are clear patterns in which some of these children took on the Abeta name. So that's pretty clear there. We know that Josefa Ontiveros, who's the progenitor of the Bustos family, she had been the sponsor and the godparent for many children as well. And some of those children took on either the name Ontiveros or Bustos. I think one or two might have been a Gonzalez as well. But in the 1600s, like Maria Villafuerte, Maria de Zamora, Pascuala Bernal, it's not clear. This is where I think folks, although we've concentrated on trying to trace these families to Spain, start looking at the Mexico City records for the 1500s. Look at the records that might have more to say about the Native American, about the Mexica Indian. And if we can look at those records, we might see some Bernals or Villafuertes or Zamoras, and we might then be able to figure out how did they get their name. Or even just look at the pattern of other Mexican Indians of that period and how they got their surname. Some were they were closely associated socially with a conquistador. And in honor of that association, they took that conquistador's name. So I think more research has to be done to answer your question. And I think it would be an intriguing line of research to do. You know, how did some of these early women? Now, Maria de la Cruz, now that one makes sense to me only because when you see names like de los Reyes de la Cruz, oftentimes when Indians were baptized, the priest would just give them that name. So chances are when you see Cruz, Reyes, etc., most likely those are folks who were Indians, and that was just the name given in the baptismal book because there was no family surname.
Interesting. Okay, Linda Serna, this is going back to her original question. I was told that his Q haplogroup means it went back to Mexico, ultimately because this was from the people who came across the Bering Strait 600 to 1,000 years ago, and they went down through New Mexico and into Central and South America, and then back up into Mexico.
Yeah, and I think you can easily find some of that information online in terms of haplogroups and haplogroup origins. And Q, my sense, and I, again, want to go online and double check all this, but I know that haplogroups A, B, and C are more frequently found down south, C in central Mexico, B and A a little further south, and that some of these, I can't remember if it's A or B, that's associated with folks that might have come across the Pacific. C definitely coming across, you know, from what's Asia across there. Q, my sense about Q, but someone can research this, or if any of the DNA folks are here, Q is pretty specific to our region here. And yeah, it has an ancient origin, like you're saying, that came across the Bering Strait, but it's pretty concentrated in our area, maybe even North Mexico. And yeah, there may be traces down south, but I do believe we're a center of that. But someone can correct me on that one. And again, you can look that up online. But if you see Q, then you know it's Native American. And I believe Q is on the male side. Is that right? Not on the female side?
I believe so. And Lee Martinez, who's the big DNA person,
he can get some more information on that. But yeah. Q, I believe, is on the paternal, and it's definitely a Native American line. So again, this could be due to Genízaro ancestry, etc. And you know, I know that earlier on, people may have been disappointed because they thought they would find themselves descendant from someone from Spain, but then they trace back to a Native American and they have a hard stop. But folks, no, you know, you have these people who founded these families, whatever their ancestry was, from wherever they came from, whatever tribe. And I think it's still important for you to document your genealogy of descent from these people, because if you have descendants in 100 or 200 years, someone's going to want to know who started this family. You know, so you need to document it, record it, and preserve it for posterity for your own descendants. And the thing is then to create that pride in that these are folks who, you know, they survived whatever they survived, these events. You know, it was traumatic for them to be taken away from their own tribal group. That's an injustice in itself. But the thing was, they were resilient enough to survive and to find a way to incorporate themselves into this culture, to create families, and to have descendants. And we need to honor that.
Okay. And Mark Leva says, my maternal haplogroup is also Q, and I've done the big Y DNA test. Lee Martinez has helped me understand the roots of this haplogroup. Henrietta Christmas says,
oh, let me go back to Mark. Mark, thanks so much. Good to hear from you. And Mark and his DNA has been some breakthrough work for us in the Leba camp, you know, in terms of understanding Leba. And we know that in Mark's ancestry, and those of you at Lebas, we know that an ancestral grandmother there had been captured during the Pueblo Indian revolt. And, you know, this is where we're thinking that some of this Q comes from, is that she may have been having children by some of the Native Americans during that time period of 13 years. So I think that that's an example of where the DNA is helping us kind of recast the picture and help us tell a story about how that Native American root came into a paternal ancestry or lineage as well. So thanks, Mark, for sharing, and hope you are doing well.
Okay, Henrietta Christmas says, Jose, you rock. This was fantastic.
Thanks, Henrietta.
Debbie
Thank
Gertler says, your knowledge and expertise is amazing. Thanks, Jose. Linda Serna says, thank you so much. This was very interesting and helpful. I always love your work and I've followed and used it for years.
Thank you.
Ariane Paul says, thank you very much, Jose Antonio. Always so much for us to learn. Owner, whom I don't know who that is, Jose, as always, your knowledge is inspiring. Linda Sena Koba, on my mother's side, we go back to Salvador de Horta, Madrid, and his wife was Maria de la Cruz Casillas Blea. Y-DNA helped my primo Miguel Madrid Jr. find our ancestors with documents and Y-DNA.
Cool, fantastic. Yep, the DNA can be used. I think with the genealogy, it's important to marry the two disciplines together for us to understand these relationships.
Okay, and Paul Gomez says, Bartolomeu Romero, member of Oñate Party. Where can I research to discover his modern day descendants?
Wow, we're all right here in this room, right here. So many of us are descendants of Bartolomeu Romero. So I'm not sure. That's interesting. You know, I don't know that anyone has, I think Ladine Miller may have put some stuff together. You know, give Ladine credit for how much work was done to compile those genealogies, but unfortunately not everything's well documented. But they're a good guide to start with, just to see the number of descendants. But Paul, I don't know that anyone's done anything to show it all the way to today. Now there are direct descendants like Ambassador Romero and a few others. We know that people have the Romero name that trace back to this. But there are many other Romeros. I have several Romero families that I cannot trace back to this line. And then there were several other Romero men that came to New Mexico as well that are not part of this family. So, you know, you'd have to tease out these other Romeros. And there's a few Romeros that are just dead ends as well. But I'm not quite sure how we would go about other than asking people through the forums, Facebook, are you a descendant of Romero? And many of us are. Many of us are.
Okay, and Lori Leba says, thanks so much for your presentation today, Jose. Wonderful as always. And Daria says, profoundly and clearly emphasized. Great presentation. Thank you, Jose.
Great.
I'd like to thank you as well. And also, Jose, is there a way, I know you have a Facebook presence and a website that's through Goodreads, I think.
Yeah.
Is that those the ways? Would everyone just?
Those are two good ways. If you can find me as my author page on Goodreads, that's a good way. Also through Facebook or Facebook Messenger, etc. Always a good way there. And certainly, if you have found information that goes beyond origins, I'm willing to work with you to post that on the Beyond Origins website. Give you credit as being a researcher, but I can help you write that up. That way, we can share your research findings with other people who might find it valuable. I know many of you are digging into records, and isn't it remarkable? I mean, I've been at this for a while, a few of you as well, Henrietta, a few other people too, been doing this for many years, but it's just really remarkable to see what's available online in terms of the records that are available for people to research. And on the one hand, I know that people are retracing work that we've already done, but I think it's important for you all to read those records and to learn, because you can always find something new. On the other hand, be cautious. There's so much genealogical fiction in our New Mexico genealogy that's online. I don't know how to stop it. I really don't. But if you have questions about it, consult through the Facebook web pages, etc. We'll get you the accurate information based on resources. Okay,
we have about 2 minutes left, and then I will end the meeting. So let's see what we can do here.
Anything else?
Linda Senacoba says, do we know how many Romero families we actually have? I have many Romeros in my family as well.
Yeah, you know, when we were doing our work here at the Olivama Lopez research group here, we had a session on Romeros where we were all trying to map out all our dead ends. We have a lot of dead ends. So I know that we have at least Bartolome Romero. We have, I forget his first name, but a Romero guy that came in 1693. settled in Santa Cruz. We have the Romero Cadimo family in Taos. I'm descendant of a guy named Miguel Romero, married to a Maria Royal that settled in the area just north of Española. And then there's lots of these other families as well. So we have quite a few different Romero lineages that, as far as we know, they're separate. And one from Mexico City, one that's Native American, one from Spain, and then these others, who knows? But there's at least 3 or 4 different distinct Romero families for sure that do not trace back to each other.
All right, and we are out of time. That was a wonderful presentation. I also learned a lot. I always take a lot of notes when I listen to you. So thank you very much, Jose, and hopefully we'll see you again. Everyone.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time and willingness to be patient enough to listen to all this information. So take care.
Great information. So audience, you can leave the presentation, this room. You can go to the main room to chat and visit with people. You may need the passcode, so make sure you use that page that Bob showed you earlier. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.